Good morning, everybody. My name is Grazia Tonetto from Lunza University, and my speech is about ultraproximity and the analysis of the individual in microfiction. You will understand why I have spelled individual in that bad way in the course of my discussion. First, the question: how long is a story on social media? It can be just an instant or a flash, like flash fiction. The modernist and the postmodernist short story recognize the instant as the most significant temporal unit within an aesthetics of the epiphanic moment. Recent developments of short fiction, since the 80s at least, display a dramatic contraction of the instant into the instantaneous, of time into real time, in a search for immanence that matches the world of the now of the fourth industrial revolution. So the intimately micronic nature of miniature writing has probably less to do with quantitative limitations than with a search for the instantaneous. My work tackles the ways in which microfiction responds to tensions that emerged within the frame of the fourth industrial revolution. First of all, let me trace some chronological correspondences. According to Klaus Schwab, the fourth industrial revolution builds on the digital revolution of the 80s and 90s with the introduction of personal computing and the internet. The 90s were a significant turning point towards data violence. The fully operational GPS, for example, was a major step towards geofencing, or the division of space into an informationally controlled grid. Then a number of innovations, such as the cookies in 1994 or the open profiling standards in 1997, marked the move away from the collection of mere audience and demographic data through registration forms to personalization and targeting. It was in the 90s then that the impact of digital technologies upon the subject was most transformative. It was then that the individual, corresponding to a name and a signature, began to be dismembered into a collection of momentarily produced sets of information, potentially disconnected from a name or a body. To paraphrase Deleuze, who was writing in the 90s indeed, individuality began to interact with individuality in various ways. Then the 21st century saw an acceleration of datification to the point that the year 2007, for example, is remembered as the first data war. The development of microfiction ran parallel to that deep cultural shift. Critics agree on the fact that the production of miniature writing increased since the 80s. Microfiction, under the specific names of sudden fiction, flash fiction, nanofiction, microfiction proper, was marketed in a series of anthologies that started with Short in 1982, continued in the 90s, and intensified in the 21st century. The National Flash Fiction Day was created in the UK in 2011. Once microfiction is analyzed in the context of the fourth industrial revolution, its major features can be easily understood in their dynamic relationship to the context, especially in two key aspects. And one is the contraction of space into a limited but paradoxically overcrowded setting, and in the progressive anonymization of characters. Since the 90s, we have been living in a world in which categorical identities constantly double personal ones. They are not diachronically persistent, but are made and remade every time we have the synchronic emergence of correlationary qualities. In this fluid fragmentation and reconstitution of the data subject, individuality is the ghost in the machine, the revenant to whom microfiction has devoted some attention thanks to the importance of anonymity as a constructive principle in this genre. In other words, let me summarize my claim: microfiction displays a tension between categorical identities and individuality. While it presents increasingly anonymized characters who are caught in tight but overcrowded spaces, many texts mourn the painful disappearance or the disturbing emergence of a sense of unique selfhood. A tight relationship exists between individuality and the space of its generation. According to Iveson and Malson, individuality is distributed across a divided and controlled space, to the point that they propose the definition of ambivisual to define the anonymous subject of datification that lives a more and more fragmented and controlled space. Space is perceived as shrunk not only for the granularity of data collection, but also because communities have become independent from geographical location and are now ever present, formed on the basis of clustered similarities. Thus, the anonymized individual is constantly segregated into a seemingly wide yet actually small self-loop of worldviews that he shares with an ever-present community. Microfiction often presents anonymous subjects collocated in very tight spaces in which they are exposed to a forced intimacy with strangers, and Intimate Zone by David Gaffney provides an excellent example. I couldn't believe it. He pushed through the door and squeezed himself onto the same seat, right next to me, touching. I told him I wouldn't be long, but he starts right in with this stuff about different cultures. We English, he says, we worry too much about personal space. I've just landed back from Spain and they have a completely different attitude. You are sitting on a deserted beach and another group of Spaniards appear. They sit up right next to you. It's a liberating attitude. We English are too distrustful. There was nothing I could do to get rid of him, so I climbed off, yanked up my jeans, and flushed. The cold water splashed up onto his bare skin, and he just sat there, looking up at me. This very short piece of fiction, published in 2006, dramatizes a collapse of private and privacy boundaries. Even the title, Intimate Zone, is a provocation. The two characters are anonymous, possibly strangers, yet they share a toilet seat, one of the most private spaces in urban environments. Intimacy has grown brutal. Private space is not immune to others' presence. In controlled societies, while anonymity is offered as a safeguard, a feeling of privacy invasion is often registered. It is what I have labeled as ultraproximity. But I would like to point out that the contraction of space in miniature writing does not depend directly on brevity. In an iconic anthology of 1986, for example, wider and multiple settings alternate in very short stories. Shrunk spaces were less common in the 80s, while their presences increased in the 21st centuries. Their choice dramatizes the space of isolation and the simultaneous forced sharing of that space with a herd of anonymous others, a human cloud of flattened individuals. And here we are to the core of my discussion, namely the correlation between anonymity and the modes of database subjectivity that permeate our own life. William Nels notices that one of the major differences between classic short story and microfiction lies in the development of character, since classic short stories are dramas of inner experience, of moral choice and psychological growth. On the contrary, in microfiction, characters are usually anonymous adults of an unspecified age. And he establishes a similarity between the stylized characterization of microfiction and the medieval fabliaux. Two elements stand out from this revealing analysis. One is the importance of anonymity in microfiction, and the other is typification. William Nels traces the reasons for the flattening out of character and typification back to brevity, since, he says, psychological nuances simply require too many words. The constraints of brevity must certainly be considered. However, my claim is that a deep relationship exists between the typified characters of microfiction and the modes of subjectivation of the digital age. The unique name and surname, the signature, used to be the correlative of the subject in the societies of discipline. Identity used to be conceived as intrinsically narrative and embodied in the absolute singularity of a realistic name. On the contrary, according to Deleuze, in the societies of control, what is important is no longer either a signature or a number, but a code that marks access to information. an oscillation or a tension between coded anonymity and moments when individuality re-emerges for the sake of disciplinary reasons, such as tax-paying, characterize our own life. Since the 90s, data protection directives have been concerned with making data safely anonymized, even if they remain personally identifiable. Quite paradoxically, anonymity has come to constitute a layer of personal identity as one that accompanies our everyday activities as we interact with devices. On the one hand, anonymity is a safeguard and a source of freedom. However, since on the internet the clustering of descriptive information around a specific user becomes sufficient to explain the identity of that user, it is the complexity of personal history, of emotional and psychological components of our lives that are drastically denied as the data subject is flattened out into an anonymous and average person. In this light, what William Nels points out about characters being usually anonymous, while the complexities of their psychology and histories are flattened out in microfiction, acquires a new meaning. And now to the issue of types. In microfiction, the characters are both literally and figuratively anonymous. They are the husband, the lover, the wife, but their attributes are sufficiently developed for the context. The husband is negatively characterized by his infidelity, for example, or might be. In other words, characterization in microfiction shows a tendency to typify the individual into categories or even intensified stereotypes. I would attribute this not to brevity, but to a shift from narratival identities to categorical ones. Through profiling and clustering, individuals are constantly dismembered in two categories of gender, age, ethnicity, lifestyle, tendency to gamble, and so on. And it is not only purchases that contribute to inclusion in two categories, but a granular monitoring of data we emanate in both online and offline activities. It is crucial to notice that categorization takes place by tracing similarities with and alongside other individualities. John Chin-Lippold defines as measurable type a coded interpretation of what it means to be an old man, for example, an algorithmic caricature that is produced by amplifying one or more features. So, types or categorical identities are an inescapable part of individuality and are constructed by excluding biographical complexity. So it would be reductive to consider the widespread reliance on types as dictated by brevity or by the logic of parable or fable alone. The question would be instead, why have modes of characterization that belong to the fable become so relevant now? What do they capture about the present? And it is especially because individuality and the complexity of biographical existence are excluded, forgotten, and the two levels of identity act in a continuous tension that my claim is that many examples of microfiction dramatize an aphanesis or a dynamic fading in and out of the subject into or from the anonymity of the type. They explored the fracture along which the name, the signature, the individual are silenced behind the type or emerge from behind that screen. So I will focus on just one vital example. In 2006, Jim Crace's story 21 was republished in Flash Fiction Forward. The main characters are the anonymous youngish man and the woman at the till who is scanning all the barcodes on his medicines, his vitamins, his air freshener, his toilet tissue, while each item triggers a thrill of recognition. This recognition is a coded reassembling of identity not in a name, but into the category young man. Crace insists on this paradoxical impersonal recognition by noticing that the computer recognized the young man's distinctive shopping fingerprint. While in the disciplinary societies the fingerprint used to point to the uniqueness of an embodied self, here it defines something incorporeal, codified, that does not correspond to a name but to the categories young man. It is at this point that the tale allows the apparition of the ghost in the machine, of individuality, by alluding to its painful silencing behind the level of data collection. Biographical complexity is hastily summarized in a series of details that have been denied any importance. The computer had lined up the young man's details. It knew broadly who he was and how he lived. Here was the man whose cat had died or ran away 3 months ago. No cat food purchased since that time. Byte-sized memory. As you can see, the significant other that is supposed to know is here the computer. But the elements of personal history, like the contraceptives he had bought 2 years ago, or the death of his cat, are only mentioned as collateral information, as something irrelevant. It is by foregrounding this belittled importance that Craze captures the violent bearing out of narrative selfhood from the anonymized and clustered set of categorizations that make up individuality. But this miniature writing also insists on the active shaping power that the anonymous individuality of the customer bears upon the constitution of an offline selfhood. Cheerats, the tale said, remind the customer that he has not purchased cereals, advise him that he ought to do more cooking for himself. He ought to tidy up and clean his bathroom tiles with our new lemon whitener. Suggest him he toward the shelves once again, at once, for what we choose is what we are. He should not miss the second opportunity to recreate himself with food. The anonymous categorization of the individual has the power to orientate the future of the individual on the basis of past choices or past purchases. Memory, as the source of a sense of self, has become radically external to the subject. It belongs to a black box that it does not control, but which can influence him. Craze closes on the sentence, for what we choose is what we are. But in this scheme, choices are false choices, since they are limited to the targeted suggestions offered by the machine. And the writer plays on the double meaning of recreate. The verb conveys the instability of individuality, which is made and remade every time we make a datafied move. So this tale shows in a clear way how typification does not follow the logic of fable or exemplum, but articulates the layered quality of identity in the digital age. The digital revolution has produced a new barred subject, which never owns itself completely, not only in Lacanian terms, but also in Pascal's black box society's terms. So now you have discovered why I have spelled individual in that barred way. I hope my short presentation has outlined how literature is responding to new modes of digital subjectivation that are completely reshaping the narratival quality of identity into a fragmented, anonymous, and synchronic typification, one in which sameness interacts with uniqueness in an unprecedented ways. And here I stop. Thank you so much for your kind attention. I look forward to discussion with you. Bye.